Imagine a world for a moment where the open and free internet as we know it no longer exists. In capitalist and free market states, the internet's segmented into paid-for tiers of content driven by socioeconomic status. Corporations control the flow of information to increase profit from consumers. And in oppressive regimes, they're in a full-blown surveillance state, where even governments have access to your IoT devices in your home and other personal spaces. Countries are further divided by their, digitally divided by their physical borders, where increased tensions between nation states and border states have risen dramatically. And even in the modest states, complicated key escrow systems and backdoors are used so nation states can control their netizens. Now, I know this hypothetical world sounds a little extreme, but it partially exists today. So what you're seeing here is a map of the world where everything in red, current and crypto laws are extremely tight. You have China and Russia that top the charts here. They've been doing encrypto laws since 2012, 2013 timeframe. On the yellow squares, yellow states, you have United States, Canada, UK, Australia, 4 of the Five Eyes countries that are looking to enact strong crypto laws. Then you have countries like India and Brazil, who are states that are kind of on the fence, and they're really looking for the rest of the world to make a decision around encryption. Now this next map is showing a map of countries that have already enacted data localization laws. So these are laws that require certain types of data to remain in the borders of each country. These laws can be implicit, so they can be a combination of different laws within the countries, or it can be explicitly defined. So my point here is, if you combine this with the strong crypto laws and the loss of net neutrality, I think we're well on our way to that hypothetical future. Now my focus here is on encryption, and there's been evidence of encryption since the Egyptians. I personally believe that encryption has existed since the advent of writing. So the moment that someone has tried to create a secret message or an encoded message and send it to someone else that they didn't want a third party to look at or analyze, encryption was born. So the question right now is, why is this so important? And the answer is adoption. If you think about it, crypto was the toy of governments, and now it's quite literally used in babies' toys. So you taking your baby's voice commands from a doll and sending it to a cloud server, for example. Now we have 4 billion people that use cell phones, that have access to cell phones in the world. We have about 3.2 billion people that have access to the internet. And we have about 1.5 billion people using communications apps that have end-to-end encryption on by default. Thanks from the great work of Google, Facebook, Verizon, SpaceX, we're going to have about 3 billion new users come online in the next 3 to 5 years. So I have a few concerns about this. Number one, we lost 5 billion records, personal records, between 2016 and 2017 of the current population. Number two, a lot of these new users will be coming in through new oppressive regimes, and it'll be the first time that they're experiencing the internet. So they're going to be a prime target for hackers, social injustice, or maybe even worse. So it's really important to get this right the first time when we decide what our policies are going to be. Now let's think back a little bit to March of 2016 during the FBI and Apple debates. We obviously identified some major gaps in policy and technology within the federal government, but it was deeper than just a US problem. This is a worldwide problem. And countries are going to look to the US and other nation states for this type of policy. And you're going to always have countries that are not going to care and may go the other way, which they're going to do strict crypto laws because they're scared of what that may bring. So if we don't really act quickly with a lot of thought, I worry that we may leave millions, possibly billions of people vulnerable without encryption. Now, there's many sides to the debate if you haven't been following. So what I'd like to do is distill down the arguments so you can understand why we are in this great cryptographic divide. That, in my assessment, most people are unhappy with the way that the government is approaching the issues. My goal right now is to educate all of you and the masses to understand the arguments so you can make better decisions about moving forward. So the first one here, for law enforcement has the duty and responsibility to protect all Americans from enemies, foreign and domestic. Now, as a former law enforcement officer with the FBI, I can attest that myself and my colleagues treated that very seriously. Now, when you're looking at protecting and serving the populace, it's a little more complex. When law enforcement finds a gap in the ability to protect the American people, then they're going to try to fix that for no other reason than that's their duty and their responsibility. Now, the second one for law enforcement here is the term going dark. You probably have heard this. This is the term that has been designated to stand for law enforcement losing visibility into their digital data collections. Now, this one's a little hard to quantify. Some people say it's true, others say it's not. What I can tell you, when I worked nation-state hacking cases, encryption definitely affected the cases that I was working on. So let's break this down a little bit. 60% of the internet is now encrypted. We have multiple dark webs, and we have billions of users that are using applications that have encryption on by default. And if you think about it, what's the most important piece of evidence to prove the intent of a crime? It's generally communications between two parties or multiple parties. So as encryption increases, law enforcement is going to have a harder time to prove that intent of a crime. And if you look at the federal statutes, proving intent is in many of them. So it's going to make it more difficult for law enforcement to prove the intent of the crime. Lawful access is another term here. It's a little hard to argue. Law enforcement and government have the ability and the right to ask for evidence of a crime if it meets a reasonable level of standard of suspicion. Okay, this is defined by law, but it's not always clear in all cases. So I've had lawyers come to me and say, hey, Jason, there's no difference between a locked box in your bedroom and an encrypted device, like a phone. And the problem I have with oversimplified analogies to cover complex problems is they generally don't hold up. So in this particular case, that locked box in your room would have to be indestructible, and even if you tried to pull evidence out of it, you would destroy the evidence in the process. That's the only way that analogy would hold up, and right now there's really no laws to define the differences between those two. The other thing that law enforcement is struggling with are outdated laws. So laws like the Communications Assistance for Law Enforcement Act, or CALEA, which was enacted in 1994, it's really meant to collect traditional communications. So think phone toll records, think voice and text. It hasn't really been modernized or updated to reflect the new world. Even laws like the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act have gaps that they need to continually improve. Now, on the corporate side, corporations have the obligation to protect the user as well, with the same level of conviction in some cases as law enforcement. The thing is corporations aren't just dealing with abuses from US law enforcement. They're dealing with potentially abuses from foreign law enforcement as well. And they're also looking at abuses from hackers, fraudsters, extortionists, nation-state governments, etc. Their other point here is they don't want the government to enforce software changes. I think most of us in this room would probably agree with this. By enforcing software changes, you're just going to push people to other platforms, likely platforms that were not designed or developed here in the US and in some other nation state that encryption laws are less powerful. On the privacy side, they're asking for absolutely no backdoors to encryption. And if you talk to the leaders in encryption and policy in this space, they all agree. If you put a backdoor into encryption, it's going to expose a vulnerability that could be easily exploited by some other third party that you didn't originally expect. Okay, I think that's pretty clear. The other argument that privacy advocates are making is that constitutionally, privacy is inherent to us and given to us by the Constitution. It should not be given to us by corporations or law enforcement. I think that's pretty clear. Okay, now that you know all the arguments, I need you to choose your side, right? And I'll let you decide which side that's going to be here. Obviously, I'm joking. The point I want to make here is I don't think this debate needs to be so binary. I think a lot of times, you know, in this day and age, we're forced into a positive or negative view about things, and there's really no room for moderate thinking. And in this case, we have to. We have to think moderately. And I do think that there is a path forward to solving this problem. Now I'm going to shift a little bit on the law enforcement side. What will law enforcement do in the absence of encryption laws? It's a very curious question. It's something that I'm going to write about with the Center for Strategic and International Studies here in the next few months, so I'll go a little deeper. But I think it's going to be a combination of law enforcement using existing techniques, enhancing some of those existing techniques, and then legal reform. So let's go through that. The first one here, lawful hacking. Just as controversial as encryption, probably more. We've already seen bills go before Congress, bills like the Active Cyber Defense Certainty Act, or ACDC for short. This act would allow corporations or individuals to lawfully hack the target of someone hacking them. This is extremely scary. Luckily, that has not been passed. But the point is, these type of laws are going to start bubbling up as we move forward in cybersecurity and encryption. The other thing is, if you've probably heard of the term network investigative technique, or NIT. This is a technique that is used by law enforcement currently. So law enforcement has the ability to actually conduct lawful hacking. And the difference is lawful hacking is generally reserved for espionage cases, where the evidence that's collected is used for intelligence purposes and will likely not see a courtroom, okay? Now, NITs have also been used by law enforcement in criminal cases. Just in 2017, the DOJ actually threw out a case against a child predator in Vancouver because the court wanted to disclose what that network investigative technique was going to be. And so the DOJ decided that they did not want to disclose that NIT, and so they actually dropped the case. There's also been indication in some cases that FBI has abilities to unmask IP addresses from Tor browsers using network investigative techniques. I imagine these things are going to increase if laws for encryption and other cybersecurity laws are not improved. Now, on the flip side of this, law enforcement has another problem. They have a big data problem. They have incredibly rich data sets, not just raw data, but metadata as well. But the problem is they're disparate data sets and sources from different locations, different classification levels, different legal boundaries. And it's really hard for an investigator to actually make the linkages between those databases. So law enforcement needs to figure out a way to really consolidate those databases. The other point here is if we're estimating that there's going to be 30 to 50 billion IoT devices that are going to be around in 2020, those are going to be ripe targets for law enforcement to collect during a regular legal process like a home seizure, for example. And those IoT devices don't have good security, they generally don't have encryption, and mostly because of the rapid go-to-market strategies of those companies to get the tool on the market. It's like Amazon Echo was the first one to come out. Everybody knows the Echo, but not so many people know the Google Home. You got to get this stuff out. Now, if we assume that law enforcement is in a going dark phase, they are going to utilize some of the other techniques in their arsenal to further cases. And two of those techniques are human, so human intelligence, confidential human sources, people that have been recruited and that are working on behalf of the government, and then undercover cases. We've already seen an increase in this type of capability in dark web cases. So think Silk Road 1, Silk Road 2, and more recently Alphabay, where law enforcement couldn't use regular legal process to gain information. And so they had to utilize some other techniques like recruiting sources and using undercover agents in the forums, in the dark web forums. I imagine that will also increase. And the last one here is exceptional access. This is the term that's designated for what the government is going to be asking for in terms of encryption and encryption laws and policy. It hasn't fully been defined just yet, but I think the key here is we need to be very explicit about what we're asking for, what the government needs, what do they want. Are we talking about encryption on the device? Are we talking about end-to-end transport using encryption? Are we talking about limiting corporations' use of forward secrecy? What does that mean? And I think it's going to be all of us that are going to have to decide and help the government decide what that actually is going to mean. Another example on the government is actually making a really good case for exceptional access right now. You've probably heard with the San Bernardino case and the Texas shooting cases where the attackers had cell phones that the government wasn't able to get into. Even Director Wray just recently announced that the FBI couldn't get into something like 7,700 encrypted devices over an 11-month period. So they're making a good case for exceptional access. Now on the legal side, what I've heard from talking to a lot of corporate legal counsels is that law enforcement requests are a burden. And they're a burden because there's a high volume, they require a lot of legal scrutiny and analysis, and then on the technical side, they still require an engineer to go gather their information. And these companies are not dealing with just US law enforcement requests, they're dealing with requests from other nations as well. And so when you're doing your legal analysis on the US side, it's usually pretty easy to figure out whether the request is going to be legal or not. But on the world side, it's hard to kind of map laws together and figure out whether those map with our current laws or corporate policy or what have you to decide whether to approve or deny the request. This takes a lot of time and effort on the side of the companies. And this really needs to be streamlined and consolidated. Now, if you think that's messy, imagine as an investigator and you need to get help from other law enforcement agencies overseas. This is exactly what the mutual legal assistance treaties were created for. If you haven't heard of the MLAT process, it's okay. It's terribly complex and difficult to use. But essentially what it is, it's a series of treaties, bilateral between two states, US and someone else, or multilateral, US and a group of countries, that allow assistance during criminal cases where they map laws and procedures to allow assistance between law enforcement agencies, okay? So let me give you an example. If I'm an FBI agent and I want to request a bank record from a bank in France, I would have to get that request approved through my chain in the FBI. I would then have to get it legal reviewed and approved through the DOJ. You would send that request to a representative in country, which would then do another legal review and then forward it to the bank. The bank would then do another legal review and then and then either approve or deny it. If they approve it, then they'll have an engineer dig up the information and then send it back through the same chain. So you can imagine this is incredibly complex, it takes a long time, and it's really difficult for investigators. Now let's extrapolate that out and say, let's assume we're working a hacking case. You have a hacker that's hacking from 20 different locations in the world, and they have 10 targets in North America, for example. You would basically have to send 30 requests, not only to victims, but also to attack targets, and you would have to wait for all that information to come back, and then just to find out that you have to do it again and again as you hop backward in that chain. A lot of times, that data is no longer available by the time you get it. So this process needs to be streamlined to really catch the modern criminal and to allow law enforcement to do their job better. This requires additional training. Technical training is really expensive, it takes a lot of time. And now let's look at state and local law enforcement, who are usually understaffed, underpaid, and don't have the level of sophisticated techniques available to them to do these things. So it's really going to require a big partnership between law enforcement, corporations, Silicon Valley, et cetera, to expand this out. And this is already happening, but we need to do it more. Now, I think our best asset that we have to us is our right to speak our opinion to public and to government. So what I'm asking for here is I want you to support the local privacy organizations that most align with your views. Unfortunately, trending a topic on Twitter is not the best way of getting the ear of government because they're still old school. So you need to pick up a pen, write a letter, pick up the phone, make a phone call, sign a petition, join a think tank to really make an effect on government. Voice your opinions to any law enforcement agencies that you know or talk to. If you don't have one, please come see me and I'll help you with that. And we're really looking for not just your voice, but we're looking for people, especially here in Silicon Valley, we're looking for creative problem solvers. We need people that have the ability in the technology world with a little bit of knowledge of policy, and vice versa, people in the policy world that have a little bit of knowledge of technology to really solve this problem. Now I want to summarize some of the things for a path forward here. I think modernizing the current laws that are available for law enforcement is really important. We need to streamline those global sharing agreements. I think we need to increase protections for corporations' continued use of encryption, and we need to explicitly define what that means. I think we need to enhance some of the law enforcement techniques and urge them to change some of the ways that they're doing things internally. And of course, better training for law enforcement and cooperation between state, local, federal, and corporations. And the last piece, which I think is really important, is we really need to help define what this exceptional access means. Government will be pursuing exceptional access where it's applicable, and we need to make sure that it's defined and very explicit. So now it's all up to all of us to move this conversation forward. My concern is if we don't do this in a thoughtful and timely manner, we can leave millions, potentially billions of people vulnerable to hackers, social injustice, and potentially worse. If a bad decision here can further isolate or fragment the internet as we know it, and will quickly become that fictitious world that I talked about earlier. Thank you.